So in our previous podcast, we talked about the early years of the most notorious North American serial killer of the early part of the 20th century, Earle Nelson. We talked about how he was showing homicidal and schizophrenic tendencies and was starting on a crime spree that at one point was predicted but it was not thwarted. So in this podcast, we're talking about his eventual murder spree that included a 10-month situation in California, Portland, and Seattle. Now, when he began his killing spree early in 1926, his first known victim was Clara Newman, a wealthy 60-year-old San Francisco landlady. Nelson entered her boarding house at 237 Pierce Street on February 2026, posing as a potential tenant named Roger Wilson. Now, sometime after entering the home, he strangled Newman before raping her dead body and hiding her corpse in a vacant apartment in a house. His second victim, 63-year-old Laura Beale, was strangled in her home in nearby San Jose on March 2nd. The silken cords which had been used to strangle Beale had reportedly been wound so tightly on her neck it had embedded in her flesh. Now, Nelson strangled and raped 62-year-old Lillian St. Mary, also of San Fran, on June 26th of that year. Exactly 2 weeks later, 325 miles south in Santa Barbara, 53-year-old Ollie Russell was strangled with a cord in her boarding house. An autopsy confirmed that Russell had been sexually assaulted after death, and the similarities in the modus operandi between her murder and the San Fran area slayings led police to assume they were connected. On August 16, 52-year-old Mary Nisbet, an apartment building proprietor in Oakland, was found by her husband, strangled to death and raped in the bathroom of a vacant apartment. Now, initially, local law enforcement questioned Nisbet's husband in her death, but he was cleared of suspicion. Witnesses later told police they had seen a smiling stranger lurking outside Nisbet's apartment the day of the murder. Others who claimed to have seen Nelson at the various boarding houses described him to police as a dark and stocky man with long arms and large hands. Because of this, newspapers began referring to him as the Dark Strangler, the Gorilla Man, or the Gorilla Killer. In the fall of 1926, Nelson relocated to Portland, where he raped and murdered 35-year-old landlady Beta Williams on October 19th. Her body was found by her teenage son, stuffed beneath clothing inside a steamer trunk in the attic of their home. The following day, 59-year-old Virginia Grant was murdered in a vacant property she owned on East 22nd Street, and her body was hidden behind the home's basement furnace. On October 21st, landlady Mabel Fluke disappeared from her home in Parkland, and her body was discovered several days later in the attic, strangled with a scarf. Despite the subsequent murders of Grant and Fluke, a coroner's jury of 4 men and 3 women was appointed on October 28 to evaluate the mysterious death of Withers. The jury's decision was split in half, with 3 believing her death was a suicide, and the 3 others believing it as a murder. Now, after committing the series of murders in Portland, he briefly returned to San Fran, where he raped and murdered 56-year-old widow Anna Edmonds on November 18th. Initially, police were hesitant to attribute the crime to the Dark Stranger. However, several days after her murder, a friend of Edmonds told police she had stopped by her home on the day of the murder and found Edmonds talking to a strange man in her parlor after a business deal that involved her selling her house. The women's descriptions of the unknown man matched those of the Dark Strangler. The following day, November 19th, in nearby Burlingame, California, a 28-year-old pregnant woman was attacked while showing her home to a man posing as a potential buyer. She has survived the attack and described the man as being about 5'8", well-dressed and well-spoken. The woman later told reporters that though she hadn't felt threatened initially, she realized in retrospect that the man had peculiarly commented on the home's intricate details, particularly the ceilings. I realized now that he was trying to get me to look up towards the ceiling so he'd get behind me and grab my throat. 10 days later, on November 29th, Nelson murdered and raped Blanche Myers in her Portland home. Police were able to recover foreign fingerprints from Myers' iron bedpost. Now, the Portland murders ignited a public frenzy, and the great paper, The Oregonian, reported that the 3rd floor of the Portland Police Bureau had become a veritable madhouse, with clerks taking hundreds of phone calls and reports of suspicious characters. Now, one local woman called police, claiming that a suspicious man had stayed in her boarding house for several days. After the Thanksgiving holiday, using the name Adrian Harris. On November 29th, the day of Meyer's murder, she stated the man told her at her residence that she was leaving to take a train to Vancouver, Washington, and indicated that he would not be returning. She found this suspicious given that he had paid multiple days' worth of rent in advance. Before departing, he gave her another female bordered pieces of jewelry as a gift, which were later confirmed by police to have been owned by Florence Monks, a wealthy widow who had been murdered and raped in her Seattle home on November 23rd. Now, in hopes of preventing further murders, law enforcement in California, Oregon issued public safety announcements to citizens in the San Francisco Bay Area. Elderly women were also advised to take precautions while renting rooms and inviting strangers into their homes. Meanwhile, the Portland Police Bureau issued the following statement to the public. Do not show your houses or rooms for rent while alone. If necessary, call a policeman to accompany you. Crimes such as these should be prevented and could have been prevented if women had been more careful. I do not wish to unduly alarm the people of Portland, but there is no denying the situation is grave. Now, from December 26th to April 27th, he moved on to the Midwest and East Coast. After leaving Portland in late November 26th, he moved eastward, hitchhiking and stowing away on trains. On December 23rd, the body of Elmira Barrard, 41, was found inside her Council Bluffs, Iowa home, and she'd been garroted with a shirt. Initially, local police presumed her death as suicide, as she had recently been discharged from a psychiatric institution. This was dismissed after it was discovered that she had been raped. Now, 2 days after Christmas, December 27th, 23-year-old Bonnie Pace of KC, Missouri, was strangled to death and raped in her home, her body discovered in an upstairs room by her husband. On December 28th, Germania Harpin, 28, along with her 8-month infant son Robert, were found murdered in their Kansas City home. Both had been strangled, Robert with a diaper, and Germania had been raped after death. Both she and Robert were discovered by her husband when he returned from work that evening. Now, Nelson continued to move further east, murdering and raping 53-year-old landlady Mary McConnell in Philadelphia on April 27th. Several articles of jewelry were also stolen from her residence. The following day, Nelson attempted to sell one of McConnell's gold watches to pawn shop owner Mary Kuhn, but she declined the items. 1 month later, on May 27, Nelson arrived in Buffalo, where he rented a room for 53-year-old Jenny Rudolph using the name Charles Harrison. 3 days later, Randolph was discovered strangled to death and raped, her body stuffed under a bed in her home. Randolph's brother, Gideon Gillet, had met Mr. Harrison when he first arrived at the residence and described him as about 33 years old, with a stocky build, dark complexion, and black hair slicked straight back. Fred Barrett, a boarder at Randolph's house, would later positively identify Nelson as Charles Harrison. On June 1st in Detroit, boarding house manager Fannie Mae, along with boarder Maureen and Torthy, were discovered murdered and raped in a boarding house that May oversaw. Their bodies were found by the building owner, Leonard Sink, who had arrived to collect rent funds from May. May had been garroted with electrical cord from a table lamp. Now, police had determined that the cord had been cut while the electrical current was still circulating, and that the knife with which it had been done would show visible burning as well as a nicked blade. Now, 2 days later, Nelson murdered 27-year-old Mary Cecilia Sistema in Chicago. Sistema was discovered by her husband on the floor of their home, strangling with an appliance cord. Several articles of men's clothing were also stolen from the home. Now, with spring of 1927 arriving, there was no indication why he decided to leave the States and move to Canada, unless he thought that it would leave the case dry. So the next podcast we'll be talking about his arrival in Canada and his time to be brought to justice. Again, listener discretion is advised with this podcast series, and we encourage you to be reminded that we do this in public service and not to exploit the aspects of the case, but just talk about the execution system in Canada that brought this gentleman in question to justice.